Welcome to the Hoops&Huddle podcast. I am Malika, and he is
Brandon with the rubric. Thank you for having this, pulling this together, Malika.
And thank you for being here. I am really excited. We are both extremely excited to welcome Theresa Runstedtler to our podcast. And she's here to discuss with us her new really great book, Blackball, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Spencer Haywood, and the generations that saved the soul of the NBA. To me, I just say Blackball, and historians exactly know what it is. So I don't even have to read the rest of the title, but I'm excited. Like one we just talked about a minute ago with Blackball. To me, it's like this is right up my alley. Like, I know Brandon, you started listening to this, and you were like, yeah, this is definitely Malika's. Yeah, I devoured it, like every word, and because there's so much detail in here. The way you do conduct your research, it's very thorough with its details. So I want to thank you for writing it. It's definitely in my library of one of my favorite historical hoop books that was written, because the 70s is this blank hole. Like, if you look at sports documentaries, like the ESPN very detailed documentary, when it I look at it all so often, and then off the top of my head, Basketball Love Story. And, when the 70s are talked about as like this drug haven, and that's when you read books, that's what you hear. You talk, they bring up the David Thompsons and the same players over and over again. What about everybody else in the league? What about Dr. J? What about, the coming of Dr. J? What about all of that? So, welcome. And welcome, Theresa, to our show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to hear good things about something I worked hard on, and just hope that it would resonate with folks.
Absolutely.
It's resonated. It's resonated because, and Brandon, let you go ahead and get a word in before I start gushing and going into.
Oh no, I just wanted to say I appreciate you putting the work into that as well. Telling these stories a lot of times about these legends, especially in this day and age when, what is it? The NBA's average fan is somewhere between 18 and 24.
I mean, now you're making me feel old.
They haven't even seen Michael Jordan play, not even in his last year. It's like he's not a real thing to a lot of folks, very much so. Like, I never really saw Wilt play, etc. So giving a lens to how a lot of these guys back then broke what I consider to be a much bigger barrier than what exists today. It's far more inclusive today. It's far more. Do we have our problems? Absolutely. But what those men and women had to go through back then is quite telling. So hearing what you chronicled in your perspective is solid. So I appreciate it. So that's why I'm excited.
Thank you so much.
Well,
I have to say, I teach students who are in the 18 to 24 age bracket. And a few years ago, I was teaching a class on the revolt of the Black athlete in the late 60s, which was the series of boycotts and protests of Black athletes as part of the Black Power movement, really trying to push back against racism within the sports industry and how they were being used as tools of American empire, essentially, on the world stage. And so I always talk about Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and my students didn't know who he was. And it lit a dagger into my heart. I was like, no, there's no way you cannot know this iconic man. So it's interesting that now it's even Michael Jordan who's becoming hazy for folks in terms of what they remember of the NBA.
Right. That's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
With Michael Jordan, it's like he's the sneaker guy, and I'm a Michael Jordan person, and so for me, it's like very bizarre. You know what I mean? I'm like, I can't even relate to not knowing who he is. But I wanted to dive right in when you know, like one of the things that stuck out to me before we even get to, because I tracked down NBA. I read something from that time, NBA and cocaine, nothing to snort at. Somehow I tracked down a reprint. There was something in the New York Times. Like I think it printed in a lot of different papers at that time.
Yeah.
And ooh, was it a doozy? I was like, the reporting back then, no wonder the, you know, like the image of the NBA was what it was, because the reporting was awful.
I mean, so
So
many anonymous sources in that
yes.
article, and it was reprinted all across the country. It was carried on news shows when the NBA wasn't
Mhm.
even really carried on national television that often. So that became, for a lot of folks, their first introduction, especially if they weren't hoops fans, their first introduction to this increasingly Black league on the national stage. And it, you know, even among historians, when I started working on this book, they would always point to that Chris Cobb's article from the LA Times and basically say,
Mhm.
oh, but what drugs? And I felt like, have you read that article? Have you looked at, you know,
It was
uh,
awful. Like,
looked at the sourcing and
Yeah.
looked at it in the context of what was going on in the late 1970s and all of these fears about crime and
mhm.
young Black men in Black
Stereotypes.
neighborhoods.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and really tried to, I guess, like look under the hood of the car and check and see whether or not this was truth versus a racialized narrative about the league. So for me, I mean, when I looked at it, I was like, oh, come on. I mean, not to say, and full disclosure, I'm not saying that nobody in the NBA was using cocaine, but the way that
No,
they made the
because they
league
were.
look like it was a haven of, you know, reprobate drug addicts,
Yep.
you know,
Yeah, that's the
irresponsible.
thing. Yeah. I like it's like, was drug use in the NBA any worse than what was going on at large? You had the Pablo Escobar and the Colombian cartels, you know, cocaine flowing into the United States from Miami, from different ports around the country. Like it was a problem at large in the United States, but the NBA was this beacon of, you know, crime, you know, like, you know, Black men, you know, like coming into their own in terms of asserting them being Black and proud, like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who was the reluctant superstar. And, you know, especially coming from when you had the Chuck Coopers and the Maurice Stokes, you know, like that was a tragic story. And we'll get to that in a
Oh
minute.
gosh, yes.
Um, and it's the 1970s was, you couldn't have the 80s without the 70s. The 70s set the stage. In the 80s, when Magic and Larry came in and lit that fire plug, that the stage was set before they got there though. And what I love about your book is it lays out beautifully how the stage was set for them by the forebears before them.
Mhm. Yeah.
Maurice Stokes, though, we could kick off right there. It's when I read about his story, and I go through people in history here and there. I just put up a post about this, the Maurice Stokes story, with him being, you know, like the first Black player to get on an all NBA team. Like he was second team, but it was like his talent level seemed like it was like first team level. He was a three-time All-Star. He was a Rookie of the Year. He was a superstar of that time. Like he was that talent. And then when he had that injury, but no insurance, just tragic how, you know, he did all that rehabilitation and he just never can get fully back. And thankfully for his teammates, he was able to, get medical care because of he was raising the funds. But Maurice Stokes and that's, when you first learned about this story, with you being a historian probably a long time ago, like, what were your impressions of that?
Well, for me, it was a symptom of the disempowerment of the players during
Mm-hmm.
Maurice Stokes's generation. So the fact that he was not even, I mean, they didn't have medical personnel
Mm-hmm.
following the team around or
Smelling
at the
salts.
games. They just kind of propped him up again and sent him going. And I mean, admittedly, folks didn't know as much about head injuries as they do now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
However, it was very clear, even to his teammates at the time, that this was a guy who probably shouldn't get on the plane. If you have air pressure changes, he was already looking wobbly, he wasn't right, he was vomiting and all of these other things. And so that plane flight, where nobody really did anything to protect him and they just let him go on his way as if he was, just a player only and not a human being who needed care, to me speaks to the fact that the players at that time treated as individuals whose bodies really mattered other than to produce a spectacle on the court. So, I think that, as you said, the fact that the league did nothing to really help him and that his career was essentially over and his life as he knew it
Mm-hmm.
was essentially over at that point. But the fact that also the players were able to come together every year to have that fundraising effort
Yeah.
on behalf of Maurice Stokes, and were able to
And the caliber of players, the Wilt Chamberlains, the Bill Russells, like you had the Kings of Kings coming out to support him every year.
yeah, and I think that really showed the fact that the players understood their own vulnerability too. It could have easily been them if
Mm-hmm.
and only by the grace of God we're not the ones experiencing that. And I think that they understood their lack of power and vulnerability as players in the league and were able to come together to, through their own mutual aid, essentially help him to not get completely lost to this system that chewed players up and spit them out. And so I think
Mm-hmm.
that event became a kind of catalyst for folks in the league to say, well, we actually need some labor protections. We need some
Mm-hmm.
health care. We need a pension. We really need to start to fight for those things. So when Oscar Robertson became the head of the NBPA, he really made it his mission to turn the NBPA into a kind of more activist-oriented union that would include not just the stars of the NBA, but the last guy coming off the bench, the journeyman players, and to make sure that they stood together as a unified force in order to have some form of leverage against the team owners. So for me, Maurice Stokes's story is at the intersection of all of those developments in the NBA. And it really shows, on the one hand, the disempowerment of the players, but then also their ability to come together and make change.
So what would you see as the most pivotal point where owners, teams, leadership, call it training staffs, whatever the case may be, when they started to see more value in the players? Because what you're speaking to is an era where players in general were not valued. Like we talk about Wilt, we talk about the Big O, we talk about all these legendary players. They still weren't valued very much. We think they're great, but their own teams didn't. The very fact that these guys could rally and come together and ownership still not pitch in. Because today, if LeBron, let's say KD, Damian Lillard, even James Harden, they stood up and said, hey, we need y'all to support this guy over here that's number 13 on the bench on this random team. Team front offices are jumping in saying, here's some dollars, here's some resources, etc. So I'm wondering, what do you think were the pivotal moments where it was that shift where teams said, oh crap, these guys are valuable. We need to treat them as more than just labor assets.
Would you say the Oscar Robertson case was that when everything kind of changed?
And even before then, I think it was a series of things. So I think the establishment of the ABA, the American Basketball Association, in 1967, even though, okay, we often think of the ABA and we think about it very nostalgically as the Black League, you know, this league that was the scrappy underdog versus the NBA. But if you really look at who the movers and shakers were in terms of the owners of those teams, these were entrepreneurs, white entrepreneurs who wanted in on the potential to make huge money in the sport of basketball. They were forecasting, speculating on the fact that basketball would become a growing sports property. So in spite of the fact that you know, they had really no intention of, you know, creating it became a Black League because Black players were very valuable in the talent war versus the NBA. So one of the things that the ABA needed was they needed good players to put on the floor to create an entertaining game so that they could create a fan base or lure fans away from the NBA. So that competition for players was really the moment when you start to see things that were relics of, you know, an earlier generation, the informal racial quota that existed across the league, where teams could only have a certain number of Black players on their roster. You know, it was an unwritten rule that maintained a form of controlled integration. So there wasn't a flood of Black players into the league. Once the ABA, you know, started courting player ages, started going to the Eastern League, started going to HBCUs, started going to places where the NBA didn't typically recruit, all of a sudden, Black players were in this position of leverage that they had never had before. That was also happening at the same time that you had a series of antitrust cases. So the first one that I think was really pivotal was the Connie Hawkins case.
Yes.
Connie Hawkins, you know, again, one of the greatest players that almost never made it to the NBA, not because of his talent, but because of the fact that he was unjustly accused of being part of a game fixing scandal. The NBA, so first of all, he gets kicked out of the NCAA, you know, is blacklisted in the NCAA. He's blacklisted in the NBA. Even though there were a few teams that were interested at some point in attempting to draft him, the NBA's top brass said, oh no, we're not even going to touch him with a 10-foot pole. But they didn't actually do any due diligence to make, you know, to check, to see whether or not he had actually done anything criminal, which he had never even been charged with anything, let alone convicted of anything. He won his, they settled his case. And not only did he win a money settlement, a substantial settlement, but he also was able to finally get into the NBA. And I think that sort of signaled to folks that the NBA was vulnerable on the terrain of antitrust law. And so you had somebody like Spencer Haywood coming in next. He was the ABA under their new hardship clause, which stated that a player could bypass the 4-year rule. Just to back up a little bit, the 4-year rule was basically a gentleman's agreement between the NBA and the NCAA, whereby these two, sports monopolies would not interfere with each other, so that the NCAA could retain its talent for 4 years, and be a free farm system to the NBA. And they wanted to keep that whole system running. And it still kind of runs today, although there is no more 4-year rule. But the ABA realized that, hey, if we can get somebody like Spencer Haywood, who's still an underclassman, before he can actually get drafted into the NBA, then we can bypass, and get him quicker into the professional ranks. But unfortunately, the team that he ended up signing with signed him to a horrible contract, which was probably fraudulent. He got into all sorts of legal
That
battles
contract
with
was
them,
criminal.
right?
And then we
so then,
negotiated it a few times. Like I was
yeah,
astounded reading that detail.
yeah, and I mean, of course, he goes out and he decides to hire an agent to help him, and the team owners of the Rockets were kind of like, why do you need why do you need representation? Don't you trust us? Here, just sign on the dotted line, or hey, we'll provide you with a lawyer to be present during the signing. So they had figured out all of these ways to really undercut the labor rights of these young guys, and he just didn't stand for it. Signing a contract with the Seattle Supersonics of the NBA. And lo and behold, the NBA says, hey, wait a second, you just violated our 4-year rule, so you're not allowed to play. And so he sued the NBA, and he ended up, getting the right to play. The 4-year rule was deemed a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. And that's why you have, players that are able to leave the NCAA when they choose to. You have players that can jump right from high school to the pros. There's no longer these arbitrary rules preventing folks from selling their labor on a free market. And so that's when the Oscar Robertson case really begins to pick up, after those two earlier victories. And I was just talking with somebody about this the other day, that I think one of the reasons why the NBPA has relative power in comparison to some of the other unions in professional sports was that they were able to hold off the merger of the ABA and the NBA for nearly 10 years. They were able to win successive antitrust cases against the NBA, with the Oscar Robertson settlement eventually undoing the reserve clause and bringing in a form of free agency. They were able to play these leagues off of each other. And so that was the moment of leverage, I think, that you were asking about earlier. And it just it opened the door a little bit, and then the players just went right through it. And took that opportunity and used that leverage to the best of their ability to change the dynamic between themselves and
okay, I get that. That makes a lot of sense. I think that's nuance that people miss. Whereas the NFL, that leverage has never been created because there was never any competition.
Well, there was a moment. So
Okay.
I mean, of course, the American Football League
Correct.
existed in the mid 60s, but you know what happened to them, which was so tragic, was that they pushed an antitrust waiver for the NFL and the AFL through Congress. They railroaded it through in 1966, and so there was no period of leverage for the players. The merger happened, and then business continued as usual, and all of that opportunity for leverage, slipped through their fingers.
Right.
So I think that actually the basketball seeing the writing on the wall with what happened to football players, and they fought to try and keep those two leagues from merging until they got some concessions.
Okay.
And I don't think people understand. I don't think players comprehend how big that, the NBPA, Oscar Robertson's, testimony, and just how his strength and his fearlessness in this case. Like you look at NBA today, and they were able to build on that and build on that and build on that. But this case is the linchpin for where they are today. I personally think they should have consulted with Oscar, but this new CBA, everything that comes out, every time I hear something, I'm like, who was in the room negotiating this? The owners, it's like, but that's a whole nother topic for another day. But like, because he suffered for it afterwards. You had owners who did not want to see him affiliated with the league after the case was over, and you had free agency didn't begin to 1988, but this case ushered it in, and you had owners not wanting him even related to the league in any way, not a coaching job, not a TV job, not a front office job. With his talents and what he was able to do for the players, you would think there would be a bevy of opportunities, and there weren't. Well, actually, no, not in the front office or anything like that. But I figured something, like with player, nothing. It was just like he was blackballed, if you will.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that was the sort of double meaning of the title, was
Yep.
that this is, the era when basketball becomes black, but it's also the era of all sorts of blackballing, political within the league, throughout labor fights for being criminalized. And so in some ways, the 70s was very double-edged for basketball. On the one hand, it was this era of incredible change in terms of the structure of how the business worked, and the players' opportunity to get their share of the profits or increasing share of the profits. But on the other hand, with all of that success, particularly from the perspective of Black players, then they also became hyper visible, and hyper visibility also led to a certain level of scrutiny that, in concert with the white sports media, became a way to kind of paint everybody with the same brush of criminality, violence, and just general comments about their work ethic or lack of morality.
Professionalism, drug abuse,
Absolutely.
misogynistic behavior when they see one or two stand out versus all of them that were in that league. It just speaks to that systemic racism that we've never seen. It's one of the reasons that I follow the NBA and even the NFL, because these are two industries, not sports, industries that are 70+% Black. There's no other industry that exists that the product itself is that Black. And I can see why it's come this way. I can definitely see it.
Interesting is that in the 70s, the NBA's top brass thought that this was a problem, right? They as early as the early 70s, they were saying, oh, geez, like, what are we going to do about the Blackness of the sport? There's a growing mismatch between who's on the court and who the fans are. And at no point in there did they actually stop to think, other than Simon Gordine, and he says this in one of his interviews.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah. At no point do they stop and say, well, wait a second, maybe we should start trying to get more Black fans into the stands. Maybe this is our entree to making the sport have a wider fan base. No, they were all up in arms about the fact that they would have a diminishing piece of the white fan base, and that they would flee to other sports because of the players.
And that was going to be my next question, because when you look at Simon Gordine and just him rising to deputy commissioner, we still haven't had a Black commissioner, but we do have presidents of Black basketball operations, like in Toronto, with Masai Ujiri. You got Michael Jordan, who's an owner of a team, the only player to ever own a majority stake in an NBA franchise. You have other front office personnel that are Black or of color. As you look at the impact of Simon Gordine, and I feel like he was in the middle of a rock and a hard place, where he was a Black man, the league was majority Black, but then he had ownership that did not look like him, who had people like Jack Kent Cook in it, who we know what kind of man Jack Kent Cook was. He wasn't exactly this bevy of equality. So with Simon, to me, he broke the glass ceiling so the others could walk, even though I feel like NBA still needs to go through another door, if you will. But it's come a long way from when Simon Gordine was in the league.
Yeah, and it's ironic that so few folks actually know who he is.
Yep.
He's such a, to use the phrase, hidden figure
Mm-hmm.
in NBA history. And yet at the time, he was the highest ranking Black sports administrator in all of North American sports. I mean, and he was essentially Walter Kennedy, the commissioner at that time, and arguably did a lot of the work.
Yes.
Did a lot of the work of keeping, keeping the New York office going and maintaining a good relationship with the NBPA. I mean, his story it's a complicated one, though, as you mentioned. He's this guy who, he doesn't fit the typical profile of somebody who has a administrative career in sports, because he wasn't a former player. He was a guy who, was part of a rising generation of Black college educated folks who were heading into positions in corporate America. He was trained as a lawyer. He acted in corporate law, antitrust law, in fact, and that was one of the reasons why Walter Kennedy found him to be such an attractive candidate, because he thought that, this guy can actually help us, solve this issue that we have with the players, where they're challenging our monopoly. And so he was put in this position where he himself understood that he was a Black man in a white man's world. That he was also somebody who believed that change could happen from within. And of course, in any point in time in social movements of all different kinds, there are folks who think that you can change only from outside. And then there are folks who think that you can make changes from the inside by reforming a system or an institution. And he was one of that, with his legal training, that he could eventually help to make the NBA more humane institution that had good relations with its players. But of course, he was the only one in that New York office. And so in some respects, he was still a token in that office, who didn't have the kind of collective power with a cohort of folks to begin to really dig in and make change. But I mean, I can only imagine what kinds of conversations he had to hear over the phone and in Walter Kennedy's office.
And I can't, Jack Kent Cooks and
yeah.
So how would you characterize some of the work he was doing One that stands out to me is his interaction with the owners, because it was already tough where there was this big divide in America, period, white and black, and then those in positions of power, those with wealth, those without, the employer-employee relationships. So it's all these dynamics, and putting, this man in this position to advocate, one for the league, one for Black men, Black people, while then still carrying the responsibility of protecting ownership as well. Like what were some of the things he did to help to do some things that people just haven't heard before or they don't know, and how he was able to build some of that success?
Well, so I mean, it's harder to get at that story. Unfortunately, he's no longer around. So a lot of what I was able to piece together came through some interviews at the time in the 1970s. One of the things that really struck me was how self-aware he was about being between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
And so he, you could almost hear the tone in his voice when he was on certain radio programs where he was choosing his words carefully. And this was even with Black media, because Black media at that time did have a suspicion of him as somebody who was, in this, this token in this office. Was he being used as a kind of face of the progressive?
Did he have any real power? That's usually what that would have been a question. Yeah.
Absolutely. Or was he just a token? So one of the things that he was always being asked was, do you think that you got this job just because you're Black? I mean, come on now. This question, and he would always have to preface it by saying, look, here are my qualifications. And so it almost made him have to defend a politics of meritocracy, whereby he was saying, look, I have all of these qualifications. Clearly, people respect me in the office, and I don't take things lying down. And so he was always trying to, prove his credibility. And that was the burden of being Black in a lily white office. And I think the most tragic thing is that many folks outside of the NBA office really believed that he was the heir apparent to Walter Kennedy. And when he got bypassed and they hired, he...
Can you repeat who they hired? Because you've been going a tiny bit in and out here and there. And sometimes on keywords, we don't hear the word, but that one I want the audience to hear.
Sure, yeah. Lawrence O'Brien. So Larry O'Brien, who...
the predecessor before David Stern.
Yes, he was eventually chosen as commissioner. And, there were calls for boycott of the league from certain sectors of the Black fan base. There were players who were saying that they didn't understand why he didn't get the position, but they did, of course, because it was racism. So I think that he felt that burden of having that position of being the one Black face in a sea of white faces in that front, the NBA's top office. And the fact that he was able to actually, maintain a good relationship with the players and keep the line of communication open during a period of a lot of strife, it was a credit to his ability and his likability. Everyone said that he was a likable guy. He was charismatic. He was somebody who knew his stuff. But, he was always somebody who was operating in the background. While Walter Kennedy and others got all the credit.
Took the credit, basically. When you look at the landscape of NBA executiveship now, and since Simon Gradine and, like, and the possibilities of the future, like, what do you see?
Oh, geez. I mean, that's anybody's guess. I'm the historian. I look backwards, not necessarily
Oh,
always
I'm with you
forwards.
on that. I was curious from your historian perspective, like, are you encouraged by what you see? Do you, is there an encouragement that more change? Because I feel like the NBA still has, like, you have Black or, like, people of color in key positions.
Right.
The most star, of course, in Charlotte, where there's a Black owner, and he has the most in terms of Blacks in executive positions. But when he sells the team, what happens then, right? So, like, I'm encouraged by Masai Ujiri and the respect that Masai has. It's not just that he holds the position, is that he does have the power and he has the respect of the position as well. So that's encouraging. I was wondering, like, how you felt about those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's always this question between I- is changing the demographics of leadership in the league going to change the fact that this is, at the end of the day, I think, as you said earlier, it's a capitalist enterprise, it's a for-profit corporation. So
Yes.
that's not going to change that dynamic of
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
owners versus laborers. That is still going to be there, no matter whether or not you have white faces as the team owner or,
Mm-hmm.
Black faces in the front offices all the way up the chain to owner. I do think that, especially in terms of what I saw from my research in the 70s, you could see that Black coaches like
Mm-hmm.
Al Adels brought in a different style of communicating with the players that respected them as individuals, as
Mm-hmm.
holistic people, as not just pieces of meat out there to put on a show. And so, in that sense, I think that having more folks who understand, um, you know, players, particularly Black players, as full human beings who deserve respect, who deserve to have their contracts honored, who deserve, ethical leadership. Absolutely, making sure that you have a more diverse um, leadership in an organization matters. Um, but it's also this question of, is that creating complete systemic change? Not necessarily. I think that there's nothing to say that the NBA is a progressive institution. I think a lot of folks have kind of bought into this idea because it has become, in comparison to some of the other leagues,
Like the NFL.
seemingly more
Mm-hmm.
progressive, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then how high is that bar? Not very not very high, if your point of comparison is the NFL. Um, but I think out of any of the leagues, definitely the thing that makes the most difference for the NBA is the power of the players. I think
Yes.
if you have disempowered players, you will always have bad management. I just
Yeah, I agree with
So if we focus on making sure that the folks who make the game, and I think a lot of times we forget that, we think of, league officials or team owners or coaches or GMs as making the game. No, the folks who make the game are the players at the end of the day. So if they don't have the amount of leverage or power or protection that affords them a voice in how the game is played and what the trajectory of their careers are. It doesn't matter who you have in the leadership position. It's just not going to be a good situation for those who are putting their bodies on the line to entertain all of us.
right.
Now,
Right.
one of the things I'm thinking about, and we just have a few more questions, and we'll let you go.
Sure.
I'm thinking about the Milwaukee Bucks back in the 70s. and what they did with um, Wally Jones. And while I consider myself a quote unquote historian, this was something that was new for me, like the Wally Jones, how he was treated by the Milwaukee Bucks, like being put on a medical, getting this medical, like where he was suspended for medical, quote unquote, medical reasons. They were suspecting drugs or something. And then
Well, they
eventually,
didn't even say, this is the thing, they didn't even say it was drugs. They just they left it open. And of course, being that it's the early 70s, people just jumped
they
to
left it for
conclusions.
inference about,
Yeah,
yeah,
they
not a weight he lost, or it was
yeah,
very shady, ruining this
yeah,
man's reputation.
right.
And then then they decide to put him on, then, they put him on waivers after, you know what I mean? Like, and he's not picked up by another team. Well, after you sullied his reputation, why would another team pick up his contract?
Right.
Um,
Another version of blackballing, right?
Another version of blackballing. I was like,
Yeah,
this is horrible.
yeah.
The NBAPA would never put up with that now. Like, I'm complaining about the NBAPA because the things that leaked about the new deal that no one has seen the full deal yet, but they wouldn't put up with a player going through that, like in during the season. That Wally Jones, and he was very very pro-black and doing a lot of things in the black community as well. They still continue to do that work after this
Hmm.
case,
He's still doing it
and
now.
and that's amazing to
Yeah,
me. That's it. But
yeah.
your book introduced Wally Jones to me, and it was and what the and you look at the Milwaukee Bucks now, that's Giannis's team. You know what I mean? Like, so it's just interesting how far the NBA has come. Did you have a question before I went into my final question?
No,
Um,
go ahead.
I was intrigued because one of the obsessions I have is limb bias. And I read
Yes.
that I read that the one, like the limb, you researching limb bias
Hmm.
is what
That's
led
actually where
you.
I started.
That's
Yeah,
where you started.
that's where I
And
started.
I was intrigued. Do you possibly have something coming on limb bias? Or, is something
Possibly.
percolating?
So that was the original project because I'm at the time when I started initially just delving into this era. I started with Len Bias because I'm at American University. College Park is
Mm-hmm.
just
Mm-hmm.
down the road, and so I went to look through their Len Bias collection, and of course they pulled me aside and they were like, "Why are you looking at this? What are you planning to do?" They wanted to know.
Really?
It's still a touchy subject. It's
Wow.
still, it was an embarrassment to the
Yes.
University of Maryland on a number of levels. And so,
Mm-hmm.
I had thought originally I was going to do this project, which was kind of like a micro history of the war on drugs
Yes.
and also to a lot of the ways in which discussions about Black quote unquote student athletes at that time really intersected with these conversations about Black male criminality in the same
Mm-hmm.
period. And he
And mass
became,
incarceration. Yeah, and
right, and
mass.
he
Yeah.
became the kind of figure that stood in for, the imagined problem. And so, of course, you probably know who Len Bias is, but he got drafted by the Boston
Mm-hmm.
Celtics
Yeah.
in the NBA draft in 1986. Shortly
Yeah.
thereafter, dies of cocaine intoxication, and his career was done. And a few months after, Ronald Reagan, you know, invokes the image of Len Bias when he is announcing his omnibus drug bill, the Anti-Drug Act of 1986, which brought in an increasingly punitive regime in the
Mm-hmm.
war on drugs. And so I was just really curious as to why what about him as a young Black man, a basketball player, was so obvious to folks at that time, for him to come to be the stand-in for all of these social ills. So I wanted to happen. And so I started digging back, and I found the story of Wally Jones, and I found the story of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Lucius Allen getting pulled over,
Yeah.
you know, and the constant reports of Black criminality in the mainstream media, and how these guys were being painted in such a way so as to make the connection between criminality and the Black athlete to be a kind of common sense for the public at large. So that's actually how the Len Bias stuff informed this project. Now the question is, am I going to go back to 1986 and complete the stuff that I had started then?
Hey,
You're
that's
starting
the
to
next
convince me.
decade. That's the
Maybe
next.
I need to do that.
You have an
But
advocate.
it's one of those stories where it became so much bigger than just the individual. It came to speak for so many conversations about
Yes.
race, inequality, policing, incarceration, the intersection of all of those things, just through this,
I think you would
the
handle it
tragedy of this
beautifully.
this one unfortunate incident.
I
So, I mean,
honestly
I do have
think
an
you're the one
article on it.
person. I think you're the one person that can do it justice interweaving, because when you talk about Len Bias, it's not just what could have been the battle between him and Jordan in
Right.
basketball circles, but he was already doing drugs. So, and Jordan wasn't doing, though he wasn't drinking like that yet. So you think about how they were taking care of their bodies. Who knows what they would have became, unfortunately. But it's the potential of what could have been Len Bias versus Jordan in the basketball circles, like his real rivalry in the 80s. That could have been something. But at the same time, when you talk about Len Bias, it's the tragedy of what occurred for his family. What you look at Len Bias and what happened with his family, and if people were to look into that, they'll know what I'm talking about. And to look at the impact on mass incarceration and in just especially in Maryland, like how the Maryland politicians just ran to DC, and ran to get something done. I think you're the writer that could interweave all of that in a way that it's digestible. So when I saw that Len Bias was a spark, I was like, I hope so. I hope she can. Because that's the next decade. Because when 78, 79, you have Magic and Larry coming in. But I feel like Magic and Larry hasn't been talking, nobody talks about Dr. J being one of those people that held the lead together before Magic and Bird came. Like, I think there were, there's other links there before Magic and Bird. I think they were pivotal, but I think the stage was being set for them, and you helped set the stage for what was going on in the 70s that led to the boom of the 80s. So I thank you for being with us. Really enjoyed this conversation with you. Love the book. And next is the big O for me. And I'm an ABA, person studying the ABA as well. So this book provided some really cool details. Any message you would like to leave for people before we get out of here?
I mean, this work was really a labor of love, and I really tried to tell the story from the perspective of the players and really deconstruct a lot of the BS that they were facing at that time, to provide a much more holistic picture of what it meant to be a professional basketball player in that time. And I think sometimes we just get enamored by the things that happen on the court, and we forget that these are just regular folks with an immense amount of talent, you know, in playing ball, but they're also, you know, just complex human beings like the rest of us. So I'm hoping that uh, definitely came through in the book.
Well,
It
I
did.
appreciate listening to you. I have enjoyed it a lot. Uh, if it's not limb bias, can you give us a little insight? What are you working on next? What's big? What's top of mind for
Oh
you?
my gosh, you know, I've been told by my husband that I must take a break this summer. I'm not allowed to start any new projects. The Len bias thing has been there for a while, so I've still got my database of all the articles about his story and a lot of the records from the University of Maryland. There's some other folks who I think deserve some research from the early 20th century. I think my comfort zone is actually in the early 20th century, believe it or
Okay.
not. Somebody like Ora Washington, who was the first really Black female sports superstar in the United States. She's somebody who I think the investigations some more writing on. You know, I've been looking, and I don't know if there's a really, really good history of the Harlem Wrens. You
Mm-hmm.
know, and that you know
I saw a
was
book on the
actually
Black Fives that I
yeah,
actually pick
yeah.
up.
Yeah, so I have that book as well. So the period right after the Black Fives, that's another sort of moment where we know a little bit about them, but we don't really know a ton about how basketball worked during that period. So, you know, we'll see. But I've been told I must take a vacation.
I
Great.
understand that. Because this had to be a labor of love and takes so much time. The thoroughness of the research is extremely impressive. I'm also looking for, and I'm gonna message you separately, the best books to research the Harlem Globetrotters, because I hear mixed things about the Harlem Globetrotters. So I'll message you. Theresa Runstedtler is on Twitter. So
Can they
that's
find you?
where.
Yes,
Can
I
folks find
am. I'm at Dr. T.R. Runstedtler. You know, if you attempt to type it in as it sounds, you'll probably find me. I'm also at sporty.prof on Instagram with the other, you know, middle-aged ladies on Instagram and Facebook as well. So I'm always happy to connect with folks. I also have a personal website, Theresa-Runstedtler.com. And, you know, I've been getting all sorts of messages from folks, and it's always a pleasure to see how the book and the work is resonating with folks.
I'm going to read the Jack Johnson book.
Oh, please
I'm
do.
purchasing it. Yeah, I'm gonna read that one because that was the one she had. But if you're a boxing buff, that's the one she had before this one. So I will be checking that out. But we really thank you. We'll have your deeds and make sure they have the spelling so they can find you.
I know. It's like, why
In
didn't
the
I change
description.
my name when I got married? Kept that
So
German name.
I appreciate you for taking the time to spend with us, and you have a really good evening. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right.
Thanks. You
Thank you.
too.
All right. Thank you.